Either for refusing to pay part of my sister's rent because she doesn't want to pay. So, I'm a 22-year-old guy living in New York with my twin sister. Well, kind of. We both moved back to New York after college, and my dad offered to help us find a place. Now, my dad has this friend who owns a few rent-stabilized apartments around the city. One of these apartments had been empty for a while because, honestly, it was in terrible shape. Like, we're talking an old, worn-out kitchen, a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, paint peeling off the walls, and some pretty sketchy flooring. Not exactly what anyone would call move-in ready. My dad is honestly one of the most generous people I know, and he really wanted to set my sister and me up for a good start in the city. When he found out about this rent-stabilized apartment, he saw it as a huge opportunity, but the place was in rough shape, like, genuinely terrible. It had probably sat empty for years, and it was almost hard to imagine someone actually living there. The kitchen looked like a throwback to the 1970s with its cracked linoleum floor and grimy, yellowed countertops. The cabinets had long lost their doors, and there were barely any working appliances. The bathroom, same story. It was small and cramped, with peeling tiles and a showerhead that barely dripped. The walls were scuffed and stained, the floors scratched up. It didn't look like the kind of place anyone would choose to live in without some serious repairs. But my dad didn't even hesitate. He took it upon himself to handle everything. And when I say he went all out, I mean it. He hired contractors to do a full gut renovation, sparing no expense. From new floors and freshly painted walls to a completely revamped kitchen with new appliances, countertops, and cabinets, he transformed the place. The bathroom got a full makeover, too, with new tiles, fixtures, and a fresh coat of paint. Every detail was carefully chosen to make the apartment feel welcoming and modern, something my sister and I could both feel proud of and comfortable in. I think he even took on extra costs for materials that would last longer or look better, just because he wanted it to be done right. By the time he was done, the place looked like a brand new apartment, and it was easily worth tens of thousands more than when he started. My sister and I were honestly in awe. I don't think either of us fully appreciated just how lucky we were to have this kind of support. In hindsight, it's incredible that he put in that kind of money and effort for us, but back then, we probably didn't grasp the full extent of the gift we were being given. It just felt like this amazing opportunity dropped into our laps. We were both thrilled we'd finally get to live on our own and have our own rooms, something we'd both dreamed of after years of sharing a bedroom. Once the renovations were done, we were ready to make it official. My sister and I went to sign the lease, and we were both so excited. We'd finally have a place of our own, and it felt like the start of something new and exciting for both of us. But that's when things started getting a bit complicated. At the time, I was the only one with a job lined up. I'd landed a full-time position that would start as soon as I graduated, while my sister was still on the hunt for something in her field. She was understandably stressed about it, and I could tell she was worried about pulling her weight financially. But I had no doubt that she'd find something soon. She's always been responsible and hard-working, with a solid resume to back it up. Given that I was the only one earning an income at that moment, we had to come up with a fair way to split the rent based on what I could afford alone. Luckily, the apartment's rent was super low by NYC standards because it was rent stabilized. The total rent came out to about $1,075 per month, which is almost unheard of in Manhattan, let alone for a two-bedroom. But even so, I didn't want to burden her right away while she was still job hunting. So, I suggested that I would take the bigger bedroom and cover 70% of the rent, $750, leaving her with the remaining 30%, or roughly $325. To me, this seemed fair. I wanted the larger room anyway, and I was okay with paying a little more. The truth is, the bigger bedroom wasn't worth double the rent, but I wanted it badly enough that I was willing to stretch my budget. My new job wasn't going to make me rich, but it was enough to handle my share, even if it would be a bit tight at first. Plus, I figured she'd appreciate the smaller payment while she got herself settled. My sister agreed to this arrangement without any hesitation. She understood that it was the best option for both of us, and it seemed like a win-win. We signed the lease with these terms in mind. So, I moved in last month, and for the first few days, I fully expected my sister would be right behind me. We'd signed the lease together, agreed on the terms, and had even spent time together planning how we wanted our new space to look. I'd chosen the bigger bedroom because, well, I was covering the larger portion of the rent. Plus, she agreed that it was fair, given our circumstances. So, I settled in and started making the place my own, anticipating that any day now, I'd be helping her bring over her things, setting up the little touches we'd talked about to make it feel more like home for both of us. But the days stretched on, and she didn't show. I waited, giving her space and not pushing her, figuring she'd be there soon. After a few days, I asked her when she planned to start moving her stuff. I thought maybe she'd just been busy with packing or saying goodbye to her room at our parents' place. She shrugged it off, saying she was taking her time with packing up her things. She assured me she'd be there soon, and while I was a bit puzzled, I didn't press the issue. Moving can be overwhelming, especially when you've lived at home for so long, and I figured she might be feeling the stress of it all. Besides, she was also starting to apply for jobs, and that kind of stress on top of moving could easily make anyone feel like dragging their feet. So, I tried to be understanding, and I let it go, telling myself she'd get around to it whenever she felt ready. In the meantime, she was still staying at our parents' place, which, to be fair, is only about 10 minutes away from the apartment. I didn't think too much of it at first. I knew she had her own room here waiting for her, all set up and ready. It was a comfortable space, the one she'd chosen herself, and she could move in at any moment. Part of me was even excited to have her join me. This was something we'd been planning together for a while, after all, and it just seemed like a given that she'd come as soon as she felt ready. During that first month, my dad generously covered her portion of the rent. This was something I assumed would just be temporary, a little financial buffer until she found a job and got settled. My dad knew how tight things might be at first, and I think he wanted to make sure we both had a smooth start. I thought that she would be using this time to get her things in order and line up some job interviews, and that as soon as she had some stability, she'd be right there with me, ready to pay her share and really start our life in the apartment. I saw it as a bit of a grace period, something to give her some breathing room to transition. She was still looking for work, so it made sense to me that she'd want to take advantage of the last bit of comfort at home before diving into the new chapter. But to my surprise, she landed a job offer way faster than I expected. She got hired pretty much right out of the gate, which honestly made me happy for her. She was set to start working in her field, and from what I'd heard, it was a solid position with a respectable salary. I overheard my mom on the phone mentioning her job offer, and from what I could gather, she'd be making around $68,000 a year. For a recent grad, that's really good, and I figured it meant she'd be ready to move in soon and start paying her share. At that point, I just couldn't see any reason for her not to make the transition. The apartment was there, her room was waiting, and now she had a stable income. Everything was lined up perfectly for her to join me. But as the second month approached, it became clear she still had no intention of moving in. It started to feel a bit strange, and I wasn't sure what was holding her back. She wasn't even trying to get her things over, let alone spending any time in the apartment. When I finally brought up the rent, I expected her to say she was getting ready to move in and would start paying her part. But instead, she flat out refused. Her reason? She argued that since she hadn't actually moved in yet, she shouldn't have to pay. I was genuinely stunned. In my mind, this wasn't the deal we'd made. She signed the lease, chose her room, and had everything set up for her. Her stuff was packed, and the room was empty, just waiting for her to bring her things in. There was literally nothing stopping her from moving in and fulfilling her part of the arrangement. I tried to be patient and understanding. I assured her that she could take her time settling in, but that her portion of the rent was still due. After all, it's not like I was preventing her from moving in. If anything, I'd been looking forward to it and had been encouraging her from the start. But she was adamant that she wasn't ready and didn't want to rush herself. It was honestly hard to wrap my head around. I tried to be as fair as I could under the circumstances, really. I wanted to find a middle ground that didn't put too much pressure on her if she truly felt and ready to move in right now. So, I offered her what I thought was a pretty reasonable compromise. I told her she could delay paying her portion of the rent until she actually moved in if that's what she preferred. I figured this would give her time to settle her nerves, get comfortable with the idea, and sort out whatever lingering attachment she had to our parents' place. But, of course, there was a caveat. I made it clear that once she did decide to move in, she'd have to pay me back for each month she missed. So, if she ended up staying at our parents' house for 3 months, she'd owe me for those 3 months when she finally moved in. I thought it was fair. After all, we both agreed to take on this apartment and split the rent. And I'm not a bank here to float the cost indefinitely. In my mind, this was an easy, no-pressure solution. She'd get to ease into things at her own pace. I wouldn't be left covering everything without any hope of reimbursement. And when she finally did move in, we'd just resume our original agreement. No fuss. I wasn't asking for anything extra from her. I just wanted her to keep her side of the deal once she decided to live here. Honestly, I thought she'd see it as a win-win. But instead of the appreciation I'd expected, she hit me with something I hadn't anticipated at all. She told me I was being selfish. She accused me of being inconsiderate, saying that since I was the only one actually living in the apartment, it was on me to cover the full rent. Her logic was that I should be paying all of it because I'm the one benefiting from the space right now. Hearing her say that really threw me. Selfish. I didn't understand where she was coming from. I thought I was being more than reasonable by offering this compromise. I had even been flexible with the fact that she hadn't moved in as we originally planned, even though I had counted on her being here to split the rent. And here I was, trying to be considerate of her feelings, offering to let her delay paying if that's what she needed. But from her perspective, it was like none of that mattered. She seemed completely focused on the fact that I was currently living there alone, as if that somehow nullified our original agreement. At this point, things started getting really heated between us. I laid out 3 options as clearly as I could. First, I told her, she could just start paying her share of the rent now as we'd agreed when we signed the lease. It seemed like the simplest solution, and honestly, the one that made the most sense to me. I reminded her that she had her own room here, ready and waiting, and could move in at any time. The second option was the compromise I'd already offered. She could stay at our parents' place for a bit longer if she needed to, and when she was finally ready to move in, she could pay me back for the months she'd missed. I emphasized again that I wasn't asking her for any additional costs, just a commitment to her portion. And the third option, if she really didn't want to move in or pay rent now, was for her to stay at our parents' place permanently. In that case, I'd cover the full rent myself and take on the apartment as my own. But if she chose this last option, I made it clear that she couldn't just expect to move in whenever she wanted without contributing. I explained that if she chose not to pay or move in now, she'd have to give up her claim to the room. It just wouldn't be fair otherwise. She didn't take this well at all. She got really upset, telling me I was being unreasonable and making things difficult for her. She insisted that I was putting way too much pressure on her and accused me of being unfair because I was giving her what she saw as an ultimatum. I didn't see it that way. I thought I was just laying out our options in a clear, straightforward way. But to her, it was as if I was trying to make her choose between staying with our parents forever or moving in against her will. I couldn't get through to her that it wasn't about forcing her into anything. It was about finding a way to balance both our needs. In the end, she stormed out and went straight to our parents. And that's where things really took a turn. I thought maybe they'd understand my perspective. I figured they'd see that I was trying to be fair and responsible, not just for myself but for her too. But to my surprise, they sided with her completely. They actually started saying that I should let her pay rent only when she decided to move in and that I was out of line for expecting her to start paying now. My dad even accused me of trying to profit off my sister, as if I was scheming to make money by having her pay rent when she wasn't living here. That really hurt, because that was never my intention. I'm not trying to make a single extra cent off her. I just want her to take responsibility for her agreed share. It's frustrating, especially because I'm paying $750 for the larger room, which was already a stretch for me financially. I chose the bigger room because I thought it was a fair trade-off for taking on a larger share of the rent. I'm not living here in some cushy setup. I have bills to pay, and I'd rather not be in a situation where 25% of my income is going straight to rent when it was supposed to be closer to 18%. Covering the full rent wasn't something I budgeted for, and it's genuinely putting a strain on me. I just feel like I shouldn't be expected to cover more than I already am, but my parents don't see it that way. They seem to think I'm being unreasonable, difficult, and, in their words, stingy about this, as if I'm not already doing my best to keep everything fair. Now my parents are mad at me, my sister is mad at me, and everyone seems to think I'm in the wrong here. But I'm just trying to stick to the agreement we made. My sister has a solid income now, she's capable of paying rent, and I think it's fair for her to cover her share even if she's choosing not to live here right now. I know my dad spent a lot on the renovations, which I appreciate immensely, but that doesn't mean I should have to carry the financial load on my own. So, Oida for wanting her to take responsibility for her portion of the rent. I'm not asking for more than we agreed on, I just want her to honor the deal we made. Update. The months that followed were rough, to say the least. My sister still hadn't moved in, and true to her word or lack thereof, she wasn't paying a cent towards the rent either. So, I was left to cover the full cost myself. Month after month, I watched my bank balance dwindle as I shouldered not only my share of the rent but hers too. It was a hit I hadn't anticipated, and while I was getting by, I definitely felt the strain. What should have been a manageable financial commitment was slowly becoming a burden. I'd budgeted carefully for the initial 70% I was supposed to pay, but suddenly taking on 100% was eating into my savings and forcing me to cut back on other things. And it wasn't just the financial part that stung, it was the principle of it. Every time I thought about the situation, I couldn't help but feel a wave of frustration and disbelief. We had both agreed to take on this apartment together, to split the rent, to share this responsibility. I couldn't wrap my head around how she seemed to brush it off so easily, as if signing a lease and committing to a monthly expense meant nothing. She had her own room here, ready and waiting. The space was set up for her, and I had even kept it free of my things out of respect for her. I thought it was only fair that she kept up her end of the deal, but month after month, she stayed at our parents' place, completely ignoring the agreement we'd made. Meanwhile, my parents were relentless in their insistence that I was in the wrong. They continued to side with her, making it clear that they didn't think I had any right to ask her to pay rent when she wasn't living here. Every time I brought up the situation with them, they told me I was being selfish, stubborn, and, as my dad put it, penny pinching. According to them, the solution was simple: just let her move in whenever she felt ready and start paying from that point forward. They seemed to ignore the fact that I was struggling to keep up with the full rent on my own, and that the arrangement we'd all agreed upon was that she'd be contributing from day one. The lack of support from my family was tough to handle. It felt like I was standing alone in a battle that, to me, was based purely on fairness. 5 long months went by like this. During that time, I adjusted to living alone, though it wasn't what I'd envisioned when I moved in. I'd been looking forward to sharing this space with my sister, to having someone to split the rent, the bills, and the day-to-day moments of city life. Instead, I found myself cooking for one, decorating on my own, and spending a lot of time in silence. It was a lonely experience, but I tried to make the best of it. I didn't fill the second bedroom, hoping that she'd come around eventually and that things could return to what we'd originally planned. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she showed up one evening and announced that she was ready to move in. I wasn't expecting it at all, and for a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe now, finally, things would start to even out. She'd take on her part of the rent, we'd get to experience living together as we'd planned, and I could stop stressing about covering the full cost of the apartment. But as quickly as that relief came, a sense of reality settled in. I'd been carrying the full financial burden for 5 months, and it didn't feel right to simply let her pick up from this point forward, without addressing the fact that she hadn't contributed anything up to this point. I calmly explained that, since she had decided to officially move in now, she needed to pay back the rent for those 5 months she missed. I reminded her that, from the start, we'd agreed to split the rent, and that I had offered her the option to pay back the months she missed once she moved in, rather than paying all along. To me, this was the fair and logical solution. I'd taken on her share in good faith, expecting that she'd cover her portion when she was ready to join me here. She had a good job now, with a stable income, and asking her to pay for her half of the months she'd missed didn't seem unreasonable. After all, this was her space too, and she'd committed to it by signing the lease. But to my surprise, she completely balked at the idea. She told me flat out that she had no intention of paying for the months she hadn't lived here. In her eyes, it simply wasn't fair, and she reiterated her belief that since she hadn't been physically present, she shouldn't owe anything. She doubled down on her stance that she'd only start paying rent from the current month forward, and that anything prior to that wasn't her responsibility. It was as if the agreement we'd made meant nothing to her. Despite having her own room here, despite signing the lease, and despite the multiple conversations we'd had about her paying back her missed months, she saw it as my problem for covering the full rent in her absence. I tried to keep my cool, but inside, I was boiling with frustration. For 5 months, I'd shouldered the financial load with the understanding that she'd reimburse me when she moved in. I'd stretched my budget, sacrificed other expenses, and essentially rearranged my life to make sure I could keep up with the rent on my own, believing that she'd honor her part of the agreement eventually. And now, to hear her refuse to even acknowledge that commitment felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't believe that she could look at this situation and still think she was being reasonable. To make matters worse, she doubled down on calling me selfish. She said I was being uncompromising and unfair by expecting her to pay rent for time she wasn't here. She framed it as if I was trying to punish her for taking her time, and she couldn't seem to see it from my perspective at all. In her mind, I was the one making things difficult, the one putting unnecessary pressure on her, and the one who was obsessed with money. It was a level of disregard and entitlement that I hadn't expected from her, and I was left feeling hurt, frustrated, and incredibly let down. Ultimately, I was left with no real options. She had firmly decided that she wasn't going to pay the back rent, and despite my efforts to explain why it was fair for her to do so, she wouldn't budge. My parents, as usual, took her side, insisting that I should just let it go and move forward. They argued that it was in the past now, and that making her pay back those 5 months would only cause tension and resentment. In their view, I should be grateful that she was finally moving in and focus on making our arrangement work from here on out. But to me, it felt like I was being asked to disregard everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd put on the line financially, just because she didn't feel like paying for the time she'd missed. I ended up agreeing to her terms not because I thought it was fair, but because I was tired of fighting. I was exhausted from feeling like the only one who saw this as a partnership, like the only one who actually cared about the commitments we'd made to each other. It felt like I had no choice but to let go of my expectations and accept that she'd never pay me back for those 5 months.